Have you ever heard of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah? They were not only known for their wealth and power but for something much darker, something that was hidden behind all the opulence and luxury. But what really happened in these places that led them to be destroyed so drastically? And what lessons can we draw from the mistakes made by their inhabitants? Today, we will explore the secrets of Sodom and Gomorrah, the hidden sins that few know and that echo as a warning for modern times. Imagine two cities of great prosperity, where life seemed easy and opportunities were abundant. Sodom and Gomorrah were not just places of wealth but true centers of attraction for those seeking a life of abundance and ease. Their privileged geographic position, with fertile lands and abundant resources, made these locations desirable for people from all over the region. Those who lived there enjoyed a life that, by the standards of the time, was high-end and considered by many as an example of progress. However, the appearance of perfection hid a dark reality. Over time, Sodom and Gomorrah became centers of excesses and behaviors that directly challenged principles of justice and solidarity. Prosperity had transformed these cities into places where selfishness, ambition, and the pursuit of pleasure became more important than any kind of compassion or empathy toward others. It was as if the very social structure of these cities had been built around self-satisfaction, relegating ethical values to oblivion. The relentless pursuit of power and pleasure made the environment increasingly hostile. Instead of promoting the common good, the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah seemed dedicated only to increasing their own wealth and comfort, ignoring the needs and sufferings of others. Strangers and outsiders, who should have been received with hospitality, were often mistreated and ostracized. The lack of empathy was visible in all aspects of life in the cities, creating a society that valued opulence and arrogance more than any other principle. This story of moral and social decay has been recorded over the centuries as a warning about the dangers of a society that distances itself from fundamental values. Sodom and Gomorrah are, to this day, symbols of the corruption that arises when power and prosperity are not accompanied by responsibility and justice. And this same narrative, which sounds like an ancient legend, remains relevant because it leads us to question whether our own society is not repeating the same mistakes by placing individual good above the collective good. Although Sodom and Gomorrah appeared prosperous and wealthy, a deeply corrupt and inhumane social system was concealed behind their luxurious facade. It wasn't just the unbridled pursuit of pleasures but a culture that encouraged the exploitation of the most vulnerable and disdain for the values that sustain harmonious coexistence. Inequality was blatant, and the accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few intensified a culture of indifference and even cruelty toward the weaker. The disdain for hospitality was one of the most visible signs of this corruption. In a time when welcoming travelers and strangers was a sacred value, Sodom and Gomorrah broke this tradition, treating visitors with hostility and often with violence. Instead of offering shelter and protection, these cities stood out for the way they despised and abused those who came from outside. This behavior was a reflection of a society that had distanced itself from the most basic principles of compassion. Injustices were perpetuated by the very power system of these cities. Rulers and leaders formed an arrogant elite that manipulated laws and administered power solely for their own benefit. Those who tried to live according to just and correct values were ignored or even oppressed, while those who followed the flow of immorality prospered. The very notion of justice had become a worthless concept, and Sodom and Gomorrah made it clear that they lived in a state of institutionalized corruption. Sodom and Gomorrah, therefore, symbolize not only the loss of moral values but the creation of a culture where the degradation of fundamental principles became acceptable and even encouraged. The sins of these cities were not isolated acts but part of a system where the pursuit of pleasure and power was ingrained. This is an important lesson. When an entire society embraces corruption and ignores empathy and justice, it moves toward a moral and social abyss where respect for others becomes an exception rather than a rule. Amid the moral chaos of Sodom, there was a figure who still preserved values of respect and hospitality: Lot, Abraham's nephew. Lot was a righteous man who, despite living surrounded by corruption, maintained practices of welcoming and generosity, sacred virtues at that time. His goodness stood out when two celestial visitors, sent by God, arrived in Sodom, and he promptly received them into his home. In a society where disdain for strangers was common, Lot proved to be an exception. The presence of these visitors in Sodom was no coincidence. They had a special purpose. These angels came to assess the real situation of Sodom and Gomorrah, to verify if the reports of corruption were as severe as claimed. They arrived at dusk, a moment when Lot was at the city gate, perhaps in a silent search for meaning amid so much moral darkness. Upon seeing the strangers, he quickly invited them to his home, offering a safe refuge in a place where compassion seemed non-existent. Lot's attitude did not go unnoticed by the citizens of Sodom, who quickly gathered around his house, demanding that he hand over the visitors. This situation highlighted the moral decay of the city and made it clear that the people not only tolerated injustice but openly encouraged it. The hostile reception of the citizens to the angels showed the level of perversity that had taken over Sodom, a place where justice and compassion were ignored. In a desperate attempt to protect the visitors, Lot risked his own safety to prevent the citizens from committing a heinous act. This moment illustrates Lot's courage and kindness amid the perversion that surrounded him, highlighting him as an exception in a society dominated by cruelty. The contrast between his stance and that of Sodom's inhabitants is one of the most striking points of the story, showing that even in a corrupted environment, remnants of goodness and dignity can still exist. The arrival of the angels at Lot's house marked the peak of Sodom's decadence. The citizens' attempt to break into the house to assault the visitors revealed the true moral state of the city. Those inhabitants had not only abandoned any sense of morality but also demonstrated aggression against anyone who represented a threat to their boundless freedom. This episode represented the last chance for change, but the moral blindness of Sodom's inhabitants prevented them from seizing this opportunity. The presence of the angels also symbolized an attempt at rescue, an offer of renewal that was ignored by the city. By sending the angels to observe the reality of Sodom and Gomorrah, God was offering a final opportunity for the city to reconsider its actions. However, the citizens' response was a demonstration that they were rooted in their sins and incapable of recognizing the importance of a call to justice. The culture of corruption and violence had become so pervasive that they could no longer even consider change. This event reinforces a powerful lesson about the gradual process of moral decay. Sodom's corruption was not the result of a single act but of daily choices that, when accumulated, shaped a society that despised fundamental values of coexistence. This progressive decline, which reached a point of no return, serves as a warning to any community that ignores the importance of justice and compassion. At that moment, Sodom had one last chance to show some remnant of humanity and compassion, but the citizens chose to remain on the path of injustice. It was as if the city's heart was too hardened to perceive the gravity of their actions. The visit of the angels was the last warning, a final chance that was ignored and sealed the city's fate. Parallel to the angels' visit, Abraham, who lived in a nearby region, received a revelation about the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah. Moved by compassion and the desire for justice, Abraham interceded with God, asking if he would spare the cities if there were righteous people there. Abraham began by asking for 50 righteous people and humbly reduced the number, pleading for God to show mercy even if there were only 10 righteous in those cities. This dialogue between Abraham and God is one of the most touching scenes in the biblical narrative because it shows a man who, despite knowing the city's corruption, still believed that divine mercy could prevail on behalf of a few righteous individuals. With each new request, Abraham demonstrated his faith in a just and merciful God who values every life and considers the possibility of redemption even amid great moral darkness. He interceded not only for Lot but for all who might still possess a sense of justice. As the dialogue progressed, however, it became clear that finding righteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah was an almost impossible task. Abraham went so far as to ask God to spare the cities if there were only 10 righteous individuals, and God, in his patience, agreed. However, not even this minimal number was found. The reality was that the hearts of those cities were so corrupted that there was no one who stood out as righteous amid such injustice and cruelty. Abraham's intercession was not in vain. It revealed the essence of divine justice and the value God places on righteousness, even when there seems to be little hope. However, it also exposed the deplorable state of a society that, through its own choices, had reached the point of no return. Abraham did everything he could, but now there was only the inevitable divine judgment on a community that had ignored all opportunities for change. God then sent a final warning to Lot and his family, giving them a chance to escape the imminent destruction. The angels, after witnessing the deplorable state of Sodom, instructed Lot to leave the city urgently, taking his wife and daughters far away. The message was clear: there was no more time. They should abandon everything and flee without looking back, for the judgment upon Sodom and Gomorrah was inevitable. The escape of Lot and his family was an act of obedience and renunciation. They were leaving behind not only the city but also the lifestyle and relationships they had built there. For Lot, moving forward meant trusting in the future that God offered them, even if it meant abandoning everything they knew. It was a moment of faith and courage, where each step represented the chance to escape the judgment that was about to fall. However, along the way, something tragic happened. Lot's wife, moved by curiosity or perhaps attachment to the past, disobeyed the angel's command and looked back. This act of disobedience had a terrible cost. She was immediately turned into a pillar of salt. This incident is a profound reminder of the importance of fully trusting in divine guidance and not allowing the past to hold us back or divert us from the path of salvation. The escape of Lot and his family was not just a physical race but a journey of faith and renunciation. They were spared but had to give up everything they knew, trusting that the future in God's hands would be better than anything they had left behind. This dramatic moment represents divine mercy but also the seriousness of God's judgment against injustice and corruption. With Lot and his daughters safe, the judgment upon Sodom and Gomorrah finally began. On the horizon, a terrifying vision formed: fire and brimstone falling from the sky, consuming the cities with an intensity that no human force could stop. The destruction was swift and relentless, turning the prosperous and lively cities into ruins and ashes. This act of judgment was not just a punishment but also a clear sign of the divine response to the injustice, corruption, and disrespect that had dominated those places. The scene of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was etched into the memory of peoples over generations. For the survivors and those who would hear this story, this catastrophe served as a powerful warning about the consequences of ignoring the basic principles of justice and compassion. Those who witnessed the event or heard the accounts understood that God does not tolerate rampant corruption and that, eventually, all actions receive their response. the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah became a symbol of judgment against impiety. Over the years, this story has been told and retold, not just as a report of a catastrophic event but as a reminder of the seriousness of divine justice. Sodom and Gomorrah, which were once cities of influence and prosperity, now served as an example of what happens when a society refuses to recognize and respect fundamental values. This destruction is also a reflection on God's mercy and judgment. Even in the face of corruption, there was a chance for change. God sent Lot and his family to safety before initiating judgment. But once the last opportunity was ignored, justice was served. Sodom and Gomorrah, once full of life and riches, were now a desert of ruins, a reminder of what happens when society completely rejects righteousness. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah raises questions that go far beyond a simple narrative about judgment. It makes us reflect on the paths we choose as a society and the values we cultivate. The destruction of these cities was not just about individual actions but about an entire culture that deviated from essential principles like justice, compassion, and respect for others. But are the errors of these cities truly distant from the reality we live in today? In modern times, the pursuit of wealth and power often overshadows ethical values, leading communities to make choices that negatively affect the collective. Sodom and Gomorrah remind us that prosperity without respect and empathy creates an unstable foundation. What happened there serves as a warning about the importance of preserving integrity and the principles that sustain healthy coexistence, even amid social pressures that encourage selfishness. Furthermore, the figure of Lot's wife, who was turned into a pillar of salt for looking back, symbolizes something profound about attachment to what is destructive. How often do we remain tied to behaviors or values that, in fact, prevent us from growing and moving forward? Attachment to a past that harms us or to practices that do not contribute to collective well-being can be as dangerous an obstacle as the wrong choices of Sodom and Gomorrah. For many, the story of these cities raises a question: what can we do to avoid making similar mistakes? It's a reflection on the need to cultivate, in the present, values that generate well-being and dignity not only for ourselves but for those around us. What would be the effect if each of us sought to make a difference in the environment where we live? The story of Sodom and Gomorrah brings a warning that echoes to this day. It reminds us that the pursuit of justice and integrity is not just an ideal but a necessity for a society to prosper healthily. Throughout this narrative, we have seen how corruption and disrespect for others can destroy not only a people's morality but also the very social fabric. Every detail of this story serves as a call for us to value the principles of compassion, respect, and righteousness. May Lot's escape and the example of his wife, who looked back, inspire us to always move forward, leaving behind what holds us back and distances us from a life of meaning and purpose. Reflecting on Sodom and Gomorrah is an invitation to examine our own choices and attitudes, always seeking to build a reality where the common good is a priority. If this story inspired you, please like the video and subscribe.